Hello, everyone. We're here for a review of World War II. We're going to start actually in the 1930s. And we all know that during the 1930s, the United States was involved in the Great Depression, economically at home, although that depression did spread worldwide. But it doesn't mean that we did not still have foreign affairs. So in 1932, under the President Hoover administration, the Japanese had invaded Manchuria, and the U.S. issued the Stimson Doctrine. And this said that we would refuse to recognize any territories that were taken over by force. As you all know, Hoover lost the presidency in 32 to FDR, and in FDR's first act for foreign affairs, he supported the good neighbor policy. And this was our attempt to improve relations with Latin American countries, saying that we would be non interventionist in their affairs. So these are just two of the foreign policies that U.S. took into action during the 1930s. But meanwhile, across the ocean, these three countries, of course, two different oceans, of course, these three countries have aggressive, militaristic, fascist dictators rising to power. And you all know those are Germany, Italy, and Japan. So the rise of that type of aggressive action is a tremendous concern for the world. And you would think that the United States, going back to the Teddy Roosevelt years of the big stick policy, would have intervened much earlier. However, I'm here to tell you that one of the reasons why the U.S. was reluctant to do so is because of this man. His name is Gerald Nye. I don't believe any relation to Bill Nye, the science guy. And Gerald Nye was a North Dakota senator. I don't know what it is about these North Dakota senators, Byron Dorgan as well. But he did a little bit of a study on the United States and its decision to go into World War One. And he concluded, again, this doesn't mean that it's fact, it's just his conclusion, that the US was motivated to promote business interests, that the bankers wanted us to go to war to make money. And you could imagine that if the United States heard something like this today, it would make people very reluctant to want to go into future conflicts. And this is precisely what happened. There was a rise in an isolationist movement in the United States, as you'll see. So this is the Nye Committee Report. I always like students to know this. I think it's good, deep understanding of the events prior to World War II. Also makes me feel better about the fact that I don't know so much about the battles like some of you do. So these are this becomes our policy. There'll be a group called the America First Committee. You might remember the name Charles Lindbergh. He was a leading figure in that. And we basically stay neutral early on in these conflicts. And an example of that is in 1936. I'm not sure if you learned this last year, but there was a Spanish Civil War that normally we would have gotten involved in between the nationalists and the fascists under Franco. And we chose not to, and it led to the victory of the fascists. Again, something that we normally would not have allowed to happen. So then we fast forward to 1938, well, actually earlier, 35. Italy invades Ethiopia, something we would not be supportive of. Germany is invading both the Rhineland and an area of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Japan has further invasions into China. And again, the US is remaining neutral. The European powers met in Munich and came up with the Munich Conference policy of appeasement. And what they basically said to Hitler is you can keep the part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland that you took. Please just don't take anything else. And this policy, the brainchild of, I believe, Neville Chamberlain, failed as Germany continued its advance into Czechoslovakia and then on September 1st, 1939, invaded Poland. That is considered the start of World War II. Again, the US, though, is still neutral, but with some subtle changes to our policies. So, the first thing we institute is our cash and carry policy. And this basically says that if allies would like supplies, they must pay for it in cash and they have to carry it on their ships. And I think you can figure this out. When we did the same thing in World War I, we did not get our payments back. We lent them money and they did not give it back. And if we did send them shipments, many of our ships were attacked prior to World War I. So that's the subtle change there. I also would like you to know that we did have a peacetime draft First time in American history where we started to draft people before we were engaged in a full declaration of war. You probably learned last year that London faced about a month of heavy artillery bombing by the Germans, and this kind of sparks our desire for a deal we refer to as destroyers for bases. We provide the British with 50 somewhat out to date but still effective destroyers. They give us some military bases in the Caribbean. And while all this is going on, a historic election between FDR and Wendell Willkie, a name you probably never heard of, takes place. This is the first and only time that a president wins a third term. And you'll see up there, people were very reluctant, even with the Depression and even with World War, to give him a third term. He got less votes in this election than he did in the previous two. Then the continued advance of the Germans leads us to change our policy now to what is called the Lend-Lease Act. Now the Allies can receive loans from us to help them in the war effort, although some people refer to this as providing your neighbor with a garden hose to put out a house fire. All right, so now we're going to transfer over to Asia and what's happening with Japan. Because of their aggressive acts, the US decided to prevent them from receiving steel and scrap iron, and then later we cut them off from American oil. Negotiations took place. We tried to settle the differences, but neither side was willing to budge. We wouldn't add oil back into the Japanese economy, and they just simply would not remove their troops from Manchuria. And this tragically ends with the Japanese bombing us at our military base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7th, 1941. This is the embarrassing part of doing videos like this when you make a mistake. And over 3,000 Americans were killed in the first attack, I would say, on our homeland, obviously, since I guess you would consider it the War of 1812. This leads to the US getting involved in the war against Japan, as well as Italy and Germany. So, how does the war impact us on the home front? I have a whole series of things here. Number one, economically, just understand that production was moved in the direction of what we needed for the war. One example I always give students is that Ford Motor Company was told stop producing cars and start producing tanks. So everything was geared towards war mobilization. We did increase taxes during the war. There was, as World War I, there was propaganda against the Germans and the Japanese in the war. And now we get to some social groups here. So we'll start with the African Americans. First group of Tuskegee Airmen were African American fighter pilots. Remember, we still had segregated units at this time. That will not be until Truman is president where that ends. African Americans then began this double V campaign, considering victory in Europe important, but also considering victory at home, still fighting for civil rights. I'm not sure if Miss Hayden or I told you, but there was a man, A. Philip Randolph, who during World War I threatened a march on Washington if they did not end the discriminatory practices of hiring people to work in the federal government. And FDR did succumb to that, did not want to have a protest at this time. So they banned the action of hiring anybody working for the federal government that engaged in racial segregation. Bracero program, when I did this in class the other day, kids were surprised about this. We actually went from a depression where unemployment was over 30% to now having a need for more workers. So we asked Mexico, could you please lend us Mexican workers to come over into the United States? And this was called the Bracero program. And it was a very significant program. Sadly, some of the Mexican workers did face violence. There was a riot in Los Angeles, I think it's referred to as the Zoot Suit riots, where some of the Mexican workers were attacked. And now we go to Native Americans and the Navajo, who we really haven't talked much about. They were used in World War II in order to code our military communication, specifically in Japan. Japan, which is an archipelago, a series of islands. If we wanted to know which island we were going to attack next, and we didn't want the Japanese to be able to break our codes by speaking through English, we used the Navajo code to do so. And women, we did this earlier in the year. Women worked in the factories. Rosie the Riveter, We Can Do It, the famous iconic picture here. And I think we also talked about women playing Major League Baseball during World War II. All right, now the most significant issue here for the war is on the home front is Japanese internment. So FDR issued Executive Order 9066. I tried to tell you this when President Trump issued some of his executive orders. This is not an uncommon thing. Every president has probably done so. Maybe not William Henry Harrison. He didn't have enough time. But the executive order called for all Japanese Americans to report to a detention center. And from that detention center, they would then be shipped off to internment camps. And the reason is that the government deemed the possibility that Japanese Americans could be spies working for the Japanese government. The conditions were horrific. Economically, these people lost their livelihood. You could imagine they'd have to give up their home, their car, their business, not knowing how long they were going to be away. We disguised these camps with nice names like Camp Harmony, but the reality was that the conditions were deplorable. And one man, who you see here with President Clinton, Fred Korematsu, I believe he was half Spanish, half Japanese, filed a lawsuit claiming that this was a violation of his constitutional rights as clearly stated in the 14th Amendment. And this Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus United States, uh, was ruled on in 1944, and he lost. Supreme Court said that this was in the need for national security was constitutional. About 40 something years later, I think it started under President Reagan and then concluded under President Bush, the first President Bush, we did make reparations payments. Every surviving family member received $20,000 from the federal government. And like you see here, President Bill Clinton gave him the Congressional Medal of Honor. Just a story that I like to tell. There was one kid who was in the internment camps, Norm Mineta, who later went on to become a member of the presidential cabinet. He served as the Secretary of Commerce under President Bill Clinton. He also served as the Secretary of Transportation under President George W. Bush. All right, 1944 was a significant year in the war. The D-Day invasion of Normandy, France took place. This is really considered like a turning point. General Eisenhower led this invasion, and it was the largest waterborne invasion in U.S. military history, and it led to the beginning of the removal of the Germans from the German-occupied area of France. Anybody that's seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, the first 22 minutes is a reenactment of the D-Day invasion, and it is quite something to watch. And then FDR goes for a fourth term as president, and he wins that in 1944. He defeated Thomas Dewey. And now we get to the end of the war, and I do apologize for all you World War II buffs who love all the military stuff. Just watch the History Channel. They should just rename it the World War II channel. And here we go. The decision to end the war with Japan is the most controversial. Italy and Germany having already surrendered, but Japan refusing to do so. During the war, we were building secretly an atomic bomb, and this is part of what is called the Manhattan Project. And this bomb was tested successfully in the desert in New Mexico. Now, during 1945, FDR, just beginning his fourth term, passed away, and the new president, Harry S. Truman, was informed about this policy. He did not know about the project prior to being president. And now he is faced with a decision. Should we use the most powerful weapon that mankind has ever seen to end the war with Japan? So why was this such a controversial decision? Well, the military experts told us that if we continued fighting conventionally in Japan, we may lose as many as 500,000 soldiers. So that would be number one. Number two, the Japanese culture of refusing to surrender was a cause for concern as well. So on August 6, 1945, after dropping down some leaflets for the people, although I believe the leaflets may have been in English, we dropped a bomb on Hiroshima. And then 3 days later, we dropped a bomb on Nagasaki. And then the Japanese eventually surrendered. The death tolls are very difficult to figure out. Some people believe initially as many as 150,000 people died on the two blasts. Um, some historians debate if the second bomb was really sent as a message to Russia, which we know we're going to be entering the Cold War following this. So that's my job on World War II for you. I hope it works out, and I will see you all in class.